Welcome to day 2 of Dawn or Doom, which is Purdue's annual conference on the future contours of technology. Yesterday we learned how to feed the world, how to distinguish between real and fake news, how to build cities that work, and how to design our grandchildren for maximum cuteness. I'm sorry if you missed it. We won't be repeating that. Today we're kicking off day 2 with what to do in the post-apocalyptic world of Station 11. If you haven't already read the book, I think I can save you some time with a one-line synopsis. As the bard himself might say, it is not in the stars to hold our destiny, but in ourselves. Professor Christina Bross is Associate Dean of the Honors College and Associate Professor of English at Purdue. She focuses on exploration and mission writings in American literature, transatlantic studies, and gender and early colonial American culture. Chris will moderate a roundtable talk titled Designing Worlds. Please take a moment to silence all electronic devices, but don't put them away. We hope to see you tweeting to the hashtag Dawn or Doom. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Welcome, everybody. I especially want to say welcome to our McCutcheon High School students. Thanks for coming this morning. As Jerry mentioned, I'm Professor Christina Bross in the English department and in the Honors College. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, and then we're going to kick this off with a couple of short excerpts from the book, and that's going to be our focus for the discussion that we're going to have up here. So to my right here is Dr. Emily Allen, Associate Professor of English and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in Purdue's Honors College. She is a literary historian by training and interdisciplinary by inclination. She works on the Victorians, who first gave us science fiction, arguably, and knew a thing or two about Dawn or Doom. Dr. Luciana Debs is an assistant professor of construction management technology at Purdue University. Her degrees are in technology, her PhD is in technology, engineering, and architecture. Prior to her current position, she worked in design management for construction and real estate development companies in Brazil. Dr. Antonio Babbitt is a professor of civil engineering at Purdue University. Before coming to Purdue, Dr. Babbitt worked in practice first as a geotechnical engineering and then as a construction manager for 8 years. His areas of interest include rock fracture mechanics, wave propagation through fractured media, and underground structures. And I should say, he's also part of the REST group.
Yes.
Can you tell us what that acronym stands for?
Resilient, and we'll talk about resilience a little bit, extraterrestrial habitats. And we'll talk about that.
Resilient extraterrestrial habitats. Mars and the moon, I think.
Yes.
We want to thank Dawn or Doom for partnering with the English Department's Big Read. We have done forums like this a couple of times in the past, and the whole idea here is to bring together people from radically different disciplines on campus to talk about a central text or idea or thing or happening. And our central text or idea or thing this time is Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. The slide that's up here right now has been cycling back and forth between two slides that show the year-long calendar of events that we have developed to investigate, celebrate, and talk about this book. So we're very pleased to be kicking things off here at Dawn or Doom. We're going to start by reading 2 very brief excerpts. I'll have my readers come up. 2 very brief excerpts from the book. And to help us do that, we have 2 wonderful English majors. Kate Reed is here on the left, who will kick us off. She's a sophomore English major. And Sarah Nolan is a senior English major with a minor in Native American Studies and Women's Studies. So I'm going to put on the first excerpt. There it is. There it is. Okay.
An incomplete list. No more diving into pools of chlorinated water lit green from below. No more ball games played out under floodlights. No more porch lights with moths fluttering on summer nights. No more trains running under surface of cities on the dazzling power of the electric third rail. No more cities. No more films, except rarely. Except with a generator drowning out half the dialogue, and only then for the first little while until the fuel for the generators ran out. Because automobile gas goes stale after 2 or 3 years. Aviation gas lasts longer, but that was difficult to come by. No more screens shining in the half-light as people raise their phones above the crowd to take photographs of concert stages. No more concert stages lit by candy-colored halogens. No more electronica, punk, electric guitars. No more pharmaceuticals. No more certainty of surviving a scratch on one's hand, a cut on a finger while chopping vegetables for dinner, a dog bite.
Okay, second one.
By the end of year 15, there were 300 people in the airport, and the Museum of Civilization filled the Sky Miles lounge. In former times, when the airport had had fewer people, Clark had worked all day at the details of survival, gathering firewood, hauling water to the restrooms to keep the toilets operational, participating in salvage operations in the abandoned town of Severn City, planting crops in the narrow fields along the runway, skinning deer. But there were many more people now, and Clark was older, and no one seemed to mind if he cared for the museum all day. There seemed to be a limitless number of objects in the world that had no practical use, but that people wanted to preserve. Cell phones with their delicate buttons, iPads, Tyler's Nintendo console, a selection of laptops. There were a number of impractical shoes, stilettos mostly, beautiful and strange. There were 3 car engines in a row, cleaned and polished, and a motorcycle composed mostly of gleaming chrome. Traders brought things for Clark sometimes, objects of no real value that they knew he would like. Magazines and newspapers, a stamp collection, coins. There were the passports or the driver's license, or sometimes the credit cards of people who had lived at the airport and then died. Clark kept impeccable records.
Okay, so here's the format. We have a couple of questions that we've prepared, that we've talked in general, but they haven't sort of heard each other's responses to them. The first 2 questions we're going to run like a round table. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, and the third question we'll start to open it up to talk amongst ourselves, and then we're going to move to questions and answers. I've got one little bit of an assignment for those of you in the audience. We just heard this, especially in the 2 passages. In the first one, we heard the things that are no more. And in the second one, we heard how the survivors of this pandemic and this post-apocalyptic world are leaving things that they care deeply about behind in a museum of civilization. So my challenge to you, my charge, is to think about the one thing that you can imagine you would be carrying and then finally giving to a museum of civilization. Think about that one thing and why. Right? And part of the reason I wanted to ask you to do this is because I want to give a shout out to our other really important partner, which is the West Lafayette Public Library, which will be hosting a Museum of Civilization exhibit in November and December. So think about the one item that you would put into the Museum of Civilization, and please join us in November, December to see what some of the Purdue students came up with that assignment. So let's start with our first question, and we're going to go past, present, and future is kind of how we've got this set up. So question 1, from your disciplinary perspective, primarily, what elements of St. John Mandel's world vision as reflected in these excerpts jump out at you? What do you first notice or hear in these passages, and why? And I'm going to ask Dr. Allen to start.
Hi, thank you all for coming. So as a literary critic, when I go into these passages, and I'm going to take the second passage first and then back up to the first passage, the first thing I hear in that second passage is the instability of tense, right? By the year 15, there were. And most of the novel is written in future perfect, so the past of the future. There will have been. And I think that tense really gets to the melancholic nature of this book, right? It imagines a future where the present that we're all living in is gone, right? And 99% of the population of the earth are gone. And there's this incredible longing for the world that is past. And the narrative shuttles between the early 21st century and then 20 years in the future when everyone is gone. And you see that shuttling both in the content, both in the narrative, and you see it in these tense shifts that are really, really noticeable stylistically when you read it. And I think they bring into us as readers this feeling of longing. Now, in the first passage, the no more, no more, no more, I hear 3 things, and the first 2 are stylistic. The first one is that it's beautiful, right? Did you hear how beautiful that passage was? Things are dazzling. Chlorinated water is lit from below, right? So the beauty of the language that she uses, which is really literary throughout, I think also gives us that feeling of longing. So these things that we don't even know that we would miss, in fact, some of these things are just irritating. One of them is people who hold their phones up at concerts, right? You can't see a concert when someone in front of you is holding up the phone. But here we have this aestheticizing of the quotidian, right? So like the everyday is made so beautiful in its absence, and I think that's really important. And the second thing I see is rhetorical, and that's this device of no more, no more, no more. And I think that's really the most noticeable thing about the passage. That's a technique called anaphora, when at the beginning of a sentence you repeat something and it really, presses down on it. And here what we feel being underlined is the absence of all the things. Right? And again, I think it brings into relief those things that we didn't even think were special or that we might miss, but they are highlighted by that. So in that, it feels a little bit like another rhetorical technique, which is paralepsis, right? Where you say that you say a thing by saying that you're not going to talk about a thing. Right? And here, I think these lost objects are all brought into being by being canceled out. Right? It doesn't exist, it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist, but we feel it. And then finally, in terms of content, I realize it's an incomplete list, right? That's the first line of that. And so I'm forced to ask myself, what else is missing, right? What else is on the list? And it took me a long time reading the book to realize that there were some huge things missing that I think make it, in some ways, almost a utopia instead of a dystopia. So among the things that are no more are many of the things that currently divide us as human beings, because in this small world of survivors, there are no nations, there are no states, there is no wealth. You will also find that people can no longer in any way afford, because they need each other and have to band together. They do not discriminate against one another. The three main characters through whom this is focalized are a white woman, a gay British man, and a Canadian who immigrated from India. And none of those things are the critical things about their identity. They are facts about them as human beings. So I think what we find is that when 0.1% of the human population is left on the planet, everyone is a minority. And I didn't even realize that it was a kind of racism-free book until very late in the book, when the main character finds the best friend that she's been looking for, and she's been telling everyone, I am looking for two musicians. I'm looking for two musicians. And very late in the book, you find that she's looking for a couple, African-American woman and an Asian man. And she's never once said that, right? It's an interesting fact about them, but what matters about them is that they are musicians. And I love the fact that the community that comes together without any of those boundaries. So that's a thing that is no more, that I think you only miss as a kind of the releasing of a weight. And it's a beautiful thing about this book.
Wow. I noticed mainly three things, and you're going to see it's a lot different, and we're going to talk about that later. In the first passage, it says at some point, no more cities. But if you think about the city as a structure, as a lot of buildings, a lot of houses, it's still there, because what happened in the book, and I'm going to say just a little bit, but you can find it just flipping the page. It's a disease that's tracked out 99%, 90% of the population in the earth. So people don't exist, but the structure is still there. So the no more cities doesn't refer to the buildings, but that collectivity. And that was what I found. It was really, really interesting. And at some point in the book, they say, they don't want to go to the big cities. They're scared of that space. And it's not as much as people, it's the space. So it was interesting that she noted no more cities, and I think, well, the cities, as I think about them, are still there, but the people are not. The second thing in the same passage is the lack of infrastructure, not because the infrastructure is not there, but because there are no more people to maintain it, no more people to calibrate it, and things start to fade away. And things that we don't even realize, right? How does the light get to your homes? Those things that you think it's just automatic, there is a machine doing, eventually there are people who maintain that, and if you don't have them, it will go away. So that was the second thing. And the third thing, that was on the second passage. Humans are very inventive, that you take an airport, so they're in the airport and they repurpose the space. So between the runways, they try to plant some crops, and they don't live normally in homes anymore. They try to repurpose other spaces, airports or shops, and they try to live in communities. So think about what is required to transform the space that is not meant for living, but so you can live full-time, 24/7. So that was my take on it.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. So my look at the book, I'm an engineer and a scientist, so it's been more about some more on the fact side than on the literary side, and I think we'll talk about that because there is an intersection, an important intersection. And as someone who designs infrastructure, and right now with the RETH project, we are looking at habitats outside of Earth, we need to ask ourselves a number of questions about what is possible and what is not possible. So in that light, as I was reading the book, one of the things that I noticed is this large mortality rate, 99% mortality rate of humankind. So just to put things into scale, right? Here in the US, we are 300 plus million people living. That means that we would be left with just 3 million people. That means about 9 people per 10 square miles, which is really, really nothing. So one of the things that we do when we design, right, and because we need to base our conclusions on something, is look at the past to predict the future, right? So I went back and I looked at the largest pandemics that we had here on Earth, right? And I look at 2. One is, the well-known plague, right? The Black Death in the 14th century. There were different stages, but the largest one was the 14th century. And the mortality rate of the people that were infected was 80%. We're talking about the 14th century when, the medicine was not as advanced as we have now. But the overall death rate in Europe was between 30 and 60%. So it's numbers that are really, really far from this 99%. The second one is what is called the Spanish flu. I'm originally from Spain. There was no flu there. We call it the Asian flu. Anyhow, the mortality rate was 10 to 20%. That means that the entire fatality rate was between 3 and 6%. So put this into context, what are the chances that we're going to have a pandemic of that magnitude and should be worried about that? So the chances, as you can see, are very small or almost, there is nothing that has zero probability of occurring, right? But the chances are extremely small. So you put together how humanity has fared in the past with these diseases and how far we have advanced in medicine and how far we have advanced in how we organize ourselves. I would say that, of course, the book needs this event to make the point, right? So there are 2 facts that are needed. One is that the mortality rate is extremely high, and the second is that the incubation period is extremely short. None of those really, we find them in our history. So it's unlikely. The other thing that was interesting to me is that you realize very quickly in the book that the best thing that people can do under these circumstances is leave the cities. And that struck me as an odd thing to do because that was perceived as, I think, as an issue of safety, right? You are afraid of the other. Because, I don't know, are you going to compete with resources? That's the first thing you think. But with 1% of the population left, in the cities there is plenty of resources. Look at the supermarkets that are out there, the food storage, the water storage that is there. Why are you leaving such a great source that is going to be supporting you? And also that you are giving up being organized and getting into an environment that is going to be more difficult to survive. Regarding the passages, on the first one, again, as an engineer, I thought that, yes, we are going to miss all these things, but they are non-essential. Your humanity can survive without cell phones. We survived many years without pharmaceuticals. There is a body of knowledge out there about how to treat diseases with plants. We've been doing this for millennia, and the knowledge is out there. So it's not as dear as it sounds, even though I understand that there are some things that we are so used to that we are going to miss them. Of course we are going to miss them, but there are not going to be things that are going to prevent us from surviving and even thriving. On the last passage, what struck me is the lack of organization. So if you look at what Clark does, he does everything. He goes and looks for food, looks for water, and cleans, and whatever. That's not how we would, organize ourselves on a city of the future. We would organize into areas that of specialty. You look at the history of humanity, right? That's how we started with the guilds and people that are going focusing on the things that they know how to do, and this knowledge is transmitted from group to group, and that's how we move forward. So that would be the right thing or the efficient thing to do, right? To have different groups. Maybe there's going to be a leadership group, there's going to be a safety group, there's going to be a food group, there's going to be a health group. So these are the things that I thought I wanted to share. Again, it's a different perspective, and I think that one of the interesting things of this panel is that each one of us looks at the book differently, and the truth is not in any of us. I think that there is a truth in the intersection.
Thank you. Actually, it's a great segue to the next question, which is about what you would, informed by your disciplinary approaches, what would be important to you in designing a future world after a catastrophic event, such as the pandemic in this novel. Another way of putting the question: what matters for survival and what matters beyond survival? So we're going to do formally again. So go ahead.
Okay. There's a motto that is written on the side of the traveling symphony's first wagon, I guess we would call it, right? Which is an old truck that is being hauled by horses because no motors work anymore. And I guess I need to back up to tell you that the main character, who is a small child she's 8, when the pandemic breaks out, 20 years later has become a Shakespearean actress that's part of a traveling troupe of players. They're called the Traveling Symphony.
As one does.
So, naturally. Yes. So half of them are musicians, and half of them are actors, and some do double duty, and they travel the Midwest. And they do on sort of a 2-year loop, because it takes them a very long time to get places. And they visit these communities that are attempting to reform, and they bring to them this kind of throwback to the great culture of the past. So they play great symphonies and they do Shakespeare plays. And the side of their first wagon says, survival is insufficient, which most of you will naturally recognize as a quote from Star Trek. It is. And that leads us to ask ourselves, right, what more do we need? And clearly, the book's answer is, well, you know, you need Shakespeare and you need music. But I think that's only a partial answer, because we also see the kind of villain of the piece, who is a character for whom survival is also insufficient, right? He has to write himself a kind of master narrative that will explain why he has survived. And in his master narrative, it's because everyone has died because he is the Messiah, and they needed to be purged, and he is going to rebuild a culture in his sort of in his image. And so you see that there are some people who bring kind of narrative to bear, you know, culture, art, storytelling to bear in a positive way, and someone who doesn't. And the main character and this more villainous character both happen to be the two people who have inherited the only two copies extant of this gorgeous comic book, and it's really framed both of their minds. So it's sort of like a scientific experiment insofar as we see two people the same age, both of them have lost their families, both of them survive in the Midwest, both of them are informed with the same narrative view, they've both read the same reading material, but they wind up really differently. And so I asked myself, like, what's the difference between them? And I think the answer is love and community. And I'm sorry to go all squishy on you guys. I'm really going like deep English professor today. But I think the thing that is essential for survival and that really makes the difference in these two characters' lives is that one has this very warm community. She does not see herself as a solo individual, but rather as someone who is part, and here's why the metaphor of the symphony is so important. Whereas the villain of the piece is, you know, a kind of maniacal individualist who thinks that it's all about him. So I would say community, love, other people, beauty, and really, really importantly, I would say creativity, which has so many different forms. I'm not suggesting creativity of the Shakespearean, of the musical variety, but people in this book who create things, who make things of any kind, are the ones who survive with their humanity intact, right? It's what, that creativity is what reminds them that they are human.
Thank you.
Okay, that was a nice segue, because I would say definitely creativity. We're more creative in times of need than when we have abundance. So we create things different. So if we don't have, and that's why if I had to start all over again, I would say, you know, what is available to me around me? Because I can't count on energy, electricity. I can't count on picking up my phone and just Google something else. You know, can I get out of here alive? There is no more Google. So you have to think, what is around? What can I use? And then satisfy your basic needs. So I always think, okay, so they're together. They're trying to live together, build a community, and they have the stationary, I would say, stationary communities in cities, and then there's this moving community around where they can be safe. And when they can be safe, they can think of other things to improve. So there is this local scale, and then at the book at some point, they're really, really marveled because they're trying to think what's 100 miles away, what's 200 miles away. They don't know if there's more people south or north. They don't know. It's kind of unknown. So think about globally. How can you reach people that are far away? So then I would try and see, you know, locally what's available. How can I survive? And then can I reach more people? Because as we said, once we gather more people, you have more knowledge, right? You have bits and pieces of knowledge, so you can put things together. And that's why the museum that we saw was so important, because you're trying to rebuild what was before. So if you have those pieces, and we can't have everything, just like I might know things about my discipline, but I certainly don't know a lot of things about English and engineering, but together we know much more. So I would start thinking, what can you bring to the table? And you always can bring something to the table. So that was me.
So as I was reading the book and looking at what happened, so the issue is what we call the lack of resilience. So if you read the book, or when you read the book, you'll see that everything crumbles very quickly. Communications crumble very quickly. You look at the TV, that nothing is organized. There is somebody showing up, and the information is not flowing well. The infrastructure collapses. There is no leadership. There is no way of reaching out to people. And I'm sure that given the past disasters and the one that we have right now, that the news is there of Puerto Rico, probably it resonates with you a little bit about these issues. So we've been, from engineering point of view, right, building the infrastructure, it's a learning process. But what we call is the way we want to approach this, not only our cities, our infrastructure, but the future is making them resilient. And resilience is the ability of a society to recover after a catastrophe, okay? So the issue is, can we, as engineers, right, as social, as a community, can we prevent 100% catastrophes? We can't. There is no 100% certainty. The issue is, if it happens, well, let me rephrase. When it happens, how can we recover, right? So if you look at the issues that we have to be dealing with, is issues of breakdown of communication, issues about breaking down infrastructure, so you don't know what the situation is in certain parts of, or has been affected by, the natural disaster, the natural problem. You don't know who is there. You don't know what their needs are. And even if you knew, you don't know how to reach them, right? So that's the way we begin to look at our infrastructure. So, so now I'm wearing a little bit the two hats here. One is the resilient extraterrestrial, because we are thinking about this stuff, right? What happens if you have a city on the moon and there is a meteorite impact? This is something that we don't think about here on Earth because we are protected by an atmosphere, right? But hey, look at the moon. The probability of being hit by the meteorite is very high. So what you design for, you're going to have one. So probably the best way to think is how you recover, right, without a catastrophic event. So that's the way of thinking. So we've come a long way, and let me explain a little bit why we're here. In the past, we would design, we call a factor safety. We said, well, what is the strength of our material? What is the load demand on our material? And they look at the ratio, and they want a ratio larger than 1, meaning that the strength is larger than the demand, right? And we would use a number that we would feel comfortable. 20% more, 30% more, 200% more, whatever it is. Then we felt that that was insufficient because we begin to see that there were problems, particularly with the behavior of some of the structures. And we went to what is called performance-based design, meaning that rather than focusing on strength, we were focusing on behavior under a certain circumstance. Then we realized that this is still insufficient because then there are the recovery, right? And also there is a problem with systems, right? We were looking at our infrastructure as isolated units. We would look at bridge X. We would be looking at hospital Y, right? And look at what happened at Katrina. There was a sequence of events, right, that at the end produced a very large catastrophe. And the problem is that they're still recovering, right? So this issue of resilience is really at the key, at the core of what we are discussing here. So the other hat that I'm wearing is that I'm part of a center here at Purdue that is funded by NSF, and we are looking at natural hazards, right? So we are looking at the response of our infrastructure, looking from a systems point of view and from a resilience point of view, looking at our communities, how they can survive and thrive after a catastrophe like the ones that we are looking at. So the approach that seems logic is a multi-stage approach. There is no single solution for a problem like this. One is that you need to be prepared, right? You say, well, as I said, the issue is not if the issue is when, right? The second is that you need to design the infrastructure, some of it to survive this extreme event. So, for example, here we live in an area that is subject to earthquakes. I don't know if you know that, but we are. So if we have an earthquake, would our bridges survive? Mm-hmm. And if they don't, how are we going to get all the support that we need for health, food, supplies, so on and so forth? So I'm not saying that perhaps the solution is make all our infrastructure that is going to survive the worst earthquake. But maybe we need to design what corridors we need to preserve such that we can get the help that we need. Okay. And the second one is have a plan to recover when there is a disaster like this. And we make progress. If you look at some of the events that we've been through, so the Chile earthquake, I think it was in 2015, it was a significant magnitude, 8.3. The infrastructure in Santiago survived the earthquake very well. So that means that all the advances in terms of performance-based design, they are working. The cities in Tokyo during the Tohoku earthquake in 2011, they survived the shaking. The problem was something else. It was the tsunami that caused the disaster, and they were not prepared. And we are not prepared either. There is historical evidence that the northwest coast of the US is prone to big earthquakes and tsunamis. Are we prepared if something like this happens? We are not. We are not. So it's not only an issue of designing, it's an issue of being prepared. So as we look at our current infrastructure, and maybe as we are looking at the other cities, and I'm going to quote Stephen Hawking here. Stephen Hawking said that in 100 years, humanity needs to colonize other worlds, the moon and Mars, if we want to survive, because of we'll be running out of resources, we're going to be running out of space, climate change. So we really need to be looking at all these, at our future, and need to invest in the things that we need to want to accomplish for the humanity, not only to survive, right? That is insufficient, but to thrive.
Thank you. Wow. Okay. So as I'm listening to the conversation, I'm hearing some points of connection. So the words I would draw out of that last response, that to survive, to thrive, we need creativity, collaboration, resilience. And the other thing I'm struck by is that all of you in different ways talked about connectivity, right? So connections to the past, to one another, and to think about connections among parts of a system and prepare for what happens when part of it isn't with us. Can we shore up other aspects of it? It was fascinating. We had one more question that I'm going to pose, but I'm going to ask us to do it in very short order so that we can turn to Q&A. So the question is this, and it's basically, what have you heard today in this discussion that has, I'm not even going to read this, right? That's challenged you, that's made you think differently about your own first impulse about the book. And if you could just quickly give us a little piece of that.
Let me start.
Go ahead, please.
Because, as I say, as we begin to look at these resilient extraterrestrial habitats, we've been starting looking at hazards, right?
Hazards,
Meteorite impacts, moonquakes. Yes, there are quakes on the moon, and there are earthquakes on Mars, right? And there is radiation, all those sort of things. And we engineers are very good. Well, we think we are good at dealing with those, right? Quantifying those. But we are missing dearly is the human component. Because cities, yes, they have to be resilient and they have to be safe. But these are places where humans need to thrive, okay? And we don't know about that. We don't know how to deal with that. And that's why we need, other people with other interests and other expertise to help everybody such that we can do what needs to be done.
Yes. For me, it was interesting seeing the English, the language point of view, and how poetic it was. I didn't even, when I was reading the passage, it was more like a list without a feeling. But now I can see there is a lot of, memories in that, especially for the people who did the transition and they saw both worlds. If you only saw one, you can't really have a basis of comparison. So that was moving. And then from the other side, from the resilient side, it was just thinking, we think disaster is really, really far away, but hey, tornadoes hit here all the time. What happens if a tornado hits McCutcheon and you don't have a school? Would you just go, yay, I don't have a school for a whole year? You got to have a plan. Everything gets, delayed. Is this something that we want as people? Maybe, maybe not. I certainly will be very bored to not do anything for a whole year, believe me.
I'm going to answer the question, but I want to have a little sidebar because I've talked a lot about beauty and creativity so far, and we've seen both of those things happening right here.
Yes.
This marvelous piece of artwork that is going together as we speak that is visualizing what we're talking about. So maybe we could have some applause for our artists. My flippant response to what I have learned is that after I pack my backpack of Jane Austen books for the apocalypse, I'm going to take these two because they will actually know how to really survive. And my less flippant response is actually more personal than kind of literary critical, is that as a science fiction nerd, I will tell you that I probably spend too much time thinking about how to plan for the apocalypse. And my son's plan for the zombie apocalypse is to get to Hawaii. And we spend a lot of time in my family talking about why that's not really practical. But then whether or not it would be a good idea. So a lot of my disaster imagination involves individuality. I grew up in Southern California. We were always waiting for the big one to hit that would kind of cleave us off the United States. And disaster preparation looked like having water in your basement and canned food. But again, it was very individual. What I heard from both of you really makes me think about how that planning must be systemic, or it's really no plan at all. I don't think it matters how many Jane Austen books and water you have in your own basement if there's no collective plan.
Nice. Thank you. Thanks to our panelists. We're gonna open it up to questions and answers. We've got 2 mics, one on each side. If you have a question for the forum here, a contribution, an answer to any of these questions from your own perspective, thoughts about the novel itself, we invite you to come up to either mic, and or if you want to come up and tell us what's the one thing that you would deposit in the Museum of Civilization, we'd be glad to hear that too. So as you're collecting your thoughts and deciding if you're going to come up and ask a question, and come on up. If I may, I've been listening to them, and I have to say that I feel like I want to give you my one little takeaway, because it's hard for me to be quiet this long. But in terms of the collectivity, and I said this when we were talking about this and getting ready to have this forum today, And I know that the director of the West Lafayette Public Library is back here. So my collectivity is the public library, is print library, because when there's no more Google, I can go find out how to build a fire with no matches from the books there. So Nick, I just wanted to have a shout out to my favorite space. Are there questions for the panelists? I invite you to come up. I see somebody like staggering to the front. You're good. Go ahead and yep. Yeah, it'd be helpful if you go to the mic, because otherwise we might not be able to hear you. Just leave it there. You can just leave it there and speak into it. Yep. So please go ahead.
Is it on? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
So do you think that with that first passage, is it a good idea to try and write a story like that to get more emotion into it? Or is it an effective way, you think, to portray emotion, or are there other ways that you'd suggest?
Do you mind? Can I start with that one? So I think she uses throughout this book all sorts of ways to capture emotion and to evoke emotion, and I think they're all necessary, right? Luciana said that you didn't really feel anything when you were reading. I got to tell you, I don't actually believe you, because I think that when we read, we always feel stuff.
Yes.
Right? We don't necessarily connect that feeling to the thing that made us feel it. And so what I would tell you is that you don't need to have a PhD in literary criticism to be able to do the thing that I did. What you need is to be mindful of your feelings, right? So the easiest way into a book is, when you're reading it, to think, man, how am I feeling right now? Right? And then go back and ask yourself, what in this made me feel that way? And that's the easiest way to kind of get into style. So I'm going to guess you're a writer, because you asked me this question. And I would tell you, write a lot, experiment a lot, and read a lot. And I think that's maybe, that last one is maybe the most important thing. And ask yourself those questions, right? Like, what about the craft has gotten me as a reader to this place?
Can I just do a little tweak, and then I'll go? I know you wanted to follow up, but also what you feel. You talked about melancholy in that, and what she took away and what she felt may not be.
Oh, yeah,
right?
totally.
And so then the question is, what tweaked melancholy for you? What gave you a different, right? That's the other way that I would think about that. But did you have a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as a writer, just the simplicity of this manages to evoke emotions from someone like me or someone like you, but I don't know if it's subjective to who the reader is, and if you'd have to go into more detail if you wanted a wider audience to understand the emotion in your passages.
Do you mind if I take this? Still take this one?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So I don't know if I'm answering the question head on, but I want to go into wider audience, because I think this is a book for a wider audience. We had this conversation amongst ourselves while we were waiting for you folks to arrive about what this book is. And we said, you know, this doesn't feel like science fiction to us, because there's not a whole lot of science in it. Then we said in follow-up, you know, it feels really literary, and we had this conversation about who would read this book or where it would market itself.
Where would it be on the shelf in the Barnes & Noble, right?
See, that's just it.
Yeah.
I think I would have multiple copies in different places because I think it's attractive to such a wide readership. So, I mean, if the question is, do I think the style of this book is effective? I wouldn't just drive from that one passage, but I would say, yes, I think this book is highly effective because it's not literary in that, and I mean no offense to my literary friends, but it doesn't have a kind of look at me arrogance, right? It's not hard to get in there. It is just beautifully and simply written, and it's so well written, I think, that the craft of it is invisible. You never read it and think, oh, I am reading a book that is very self-consciously important. You're in, and I love that about it.
Thank you. I'm going to go to this side.
Perfect. So thank you for being here today and speaking to us. I really appreciate it. So I actually haven't read this book, but I found myself during this discussion comparing it to other literature and movies and real-world examples of, I guess, the future and new worlds. So I'm curious what your opinions are, if there's any real-world examples or any other novels that really relate or are diverse from your opinions and discussion today.
For me, it's a little bit like Mad Max. In the movie side of things, I'm more of a movie person, where you have that. Even though Mad Max is a little more on the survival side, this one has the survival, but it has also the what can you add on top of it, so it's not just basic needs. You have also music and all those things that add to that. But yeah, Mad Max was something that was on the back of my mind.
But sadly, it lacks the Charlize Theron kick-ass
with the black.
nature of that.
I was also going to say, if I may, that I kept thinking about post-apocalyptic fiction and movies that is not like. And I don't know how many of you are Walking Dead fans, right? But The Walking Dead has such an unremittingly bleak understanding of human nature. And this one, as we've all suggested, this one actually taps into the things that from our disciplines we think is so important, which is human connection, and not, the constant waiting for the really evil human to come and take over.
So for me, it's one of these series of books that humanity is reduced significantly, and the infrastructure is there left, right? These are the things that, again, for me, it's difficult to understand. I think there is a cataclysm, and we had those in the past, right? There is this theory that one of the largest extinctions of life here on Earth was because there was a meteorite impact, right? And we even there was talk, in the few decades ago about World War III, right? So these I see more possible, improbable, but possible, but that would require both the humanity and the infrastructure to really be significantly damaged. But this idea that something happens, that the infrastructure is preserved and humanity disappears, I find it. So that book would be part of this way of thinking, but I find it is improbable.
I'll answer hopefully quickly so we can get on to the next question. But I'm going to confess to you that I haven't had a television for 12 years. So my cultural touchstones tend not to be so contemporary. And I've been waiting this whole time to be able to open up a can of Victorians. So I'm going to do that right now, which is to say that the Victorians, who are my people, thought a lot about apocalypse because it was during that period that scientifically they first figured out that, first of all, there had been an extinction event, right? So they discovered fossils. They also figured out that the laws of thermodynamics didn't look good for the future. So for the first time, they could imagine secular apocalypse, right? Something that wasn't the hand of God. And this was huge for them. And this created a whole genre of fiction that was thinking about the apocalypse. And in Victorian apocalyptic fiction, the worst thing that can happen to you is to be the last person standing, right? You don't want that. You want to be part of a collective. I believe that's because the Victorians as people were so enamored of civic life. They were so enamored of what it was to be a collective. And there's a huge shift when we move into the 20th century. So when you look at 20th century American things, anything up to 12 years ago when I went dark, what you see is the lionization of the individual. So there, it's always the single person who is going to pull us back from the brink. It's Neo in The Matrix. I think any of the recent YA fictions, and I can imagine lots of them, but there's always one, right? There's always one teenager who is an individual who is different, divergent from everyone else, right? And that person's going to save us. And what I love about this particular book is that it doesn't give us the fantasy of the single heroic individual, but rather a group of people whose heroism is that they can actually work together.
Even when they don't like each other. Yeah. Yes.
Dr. Allen, you actually just touched on the question I was going to ask. So basically, we've basically talked about the resilience in the community and the importance of such and creativity working together. However, it was stated earlier that your initial response is to think of me and think of my family. What am I going to put in my basement? How much water do I need? What's our plan? When are we going to Hawaii? So my question is, at what point do we start working together as a community? Is a pandemic going to be enough to force people to work together and stop thinking, oh, well, I'm going to survive and my family's going to survive, and that's all that matters?
Like way long ago, we needed to start thinking this way. So I'm going to say right now, because Antonio has already said, we don't need to think about hypothetical disasters. Thank you for this beautiful question, by the way. There's no hypothetical about disaster, right? It's not just that it is going to happen, but it is happening around us every single day. And when are we going to learn from that, that it takes a collective prep response? Apparently survivalists are no longer called survivalists, they're called preppers now. And New York Times ran a piece, it was a catalog, what to take to the apocalypse. It was in this last week's New York Times. And it had a list of things, and what struck me was how individually focused it was, right? You can buy a really expensive kit that is your prep kit. But none of it, I think, speaks to where we are as a species right now, which is that we need plans to have already happened or start right this moment. I don't know if that sounded hysterical enough.
We're going to turn over to the scientist to start this one.
I agree. We have to have a plan that involves everybody, because you cannot fight those things alone. Like, I went to California in early August, and I was so happy I was going to do all the A1, and there was a huge landslide that you think, we have all this power, all this science, it's gonna take 8 months to clear it up. So, and believe me, it won't take one person just shoveling. It takes a collective thought of how are you going to structure that restoration, essentially. So these small things are happening, and that those are forcing us to see, but nothing stops something from happening right now, and I don't have a plan. So maybe I should stop talking and start thinking, who do I go to? Who do I talk? Do I have the safety net around me?
So for me, it's not an issue of lack of knowledge. It's an issue of maybe political will. Early 2000s, with other people, we went to Turkey to look at some of the damage that was produced by earthquakes there. And we were appalled that there was a number of schools that collapsed and caused the death of a large number of children. And it was clear to us that it was not the lack of knowledge. Turkey has excellent engineers. It was the breakdown of communication. It was a combination of things. A breakdown of communication from the authorities to the local government, maybe lack of quality control, then we, in this latest earthquake in Mexico, there is a school that collapsed. Again, that is unacceptable. And again, it's not because we don't lack the knowledge. It's not that we don't know how to do these things. We do. We have known these things for decades now. So why aren't we implementing them? And I think that there is this thought from a number of our leaders is that it's not going to happen under my watch. So then we don't have to spend or devote resources to do these sort of things. So it's a matter of political society will of doing this, and we have to do that. Look at every year we have earthquakes, natural disasters that always take the same toll of people dying on buildings that should not be damaged or collapse, hospitals, schools, that sort of thing. That should not happen, and we keep seeing those happening. And as I said, I think it's a lack of realization that we need to invest resources from this.
Lack of imagination too, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, no.
This will be our last question, and then we'll wrap up.
My question is, so basically you guys read the book and you've seen how at the end people, like how they reacted to the pandemic, how they did things to like survive. So my question is, do you believe there's really any proper way to prepare for it? Like any way to actually like even be ready for like such a disaster? Like to see people dying, like to know like your uncle is dead now, like you no longer have a daughter. Do you believe there's any way to prepare?
Wow. I don't know how to answer. I don't think there is a way to prepare for these sort of things. I don't think that as individuals we can prepare to survive such a catastrophe. As individuals, we can prepare to survive a few days that there is a tornado and then your house gets destroyed and then you're going to have enough food and water until help arrives, right?
Yeah.
But as individuals, to survive a catastrophe of this magnitude, there is no way. There's not enough food or water that you can store, right? So the approach is that we as a society, as a collective, we get together and we plan, because that's the way that then we can move forward, but not as individuals.
Yeah, my response would be, just plan to have that safety net. I mean, I've been in situations where I've seen people panicking, and you need to have someone there to kind of snap out of it. We need to do something. I have a friend who has a friend in Puerto Rico now, and he said, I have to hold the baby high with the water. And he said, well, where is everybody else? Everybody else is panicking, so someone has to take action. And it is really hard for you to see those things happening and take action if you're by yourself. If you see those disasters, like people dying in front of you, it's really hard to have hope and you kind of break down. So you have to have that safety net. So I would say prepare for the safety net, and I mean collectively we can figure out everything else.
Next time we do this panel, we're going to have a fourth speaker, and that person should be a psychologist, because I think that's what you're really asking is how do you prepare psychologically and emotionally for this? And that's a completely separate thing from anything that I think the three of us have, are prepared to talk about. But I do think that our colleagues who are psychologists would have an answer to that, because I believe that in the psychology of resilience, you find that people who are psychologically healthy or connected to their community more tightly on the way into a disaster deal with it better on the flip side. But again, that's not a literature that I know.
Actually, it is true. Societies that are well connected and very close together, they recover faster than societies that are loosely connected.
There's been interesting research on that.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your question.
Great question.
I think this is a moment then to maybe say what I'm hearing everyone talk about is that we don't maybe have a means to anticipate a massive pandemic of the sort that Station 11 is using as the signal plot device. But we wanted to be sure that we ended this panel with a reminder that while we're talking about fictional post-apocalyptic, that there are these events happening right now that are being reported in our news media as apocalypse. That word, I mean, you'll see it in all of the headlines that were here. What I'm hearing from you all as we wrap up here is that we are standing on stable ground, at least right now. And those of us individually as a group who are able to stand on stable ground, our responsibility now is to reach out to those who are not. And so we wanted to make sure that we ended a panel on fiction and post-apocalypse with a reminder that for too many people right now and so often, it's not fiction. Thank you so much for being at the panel. Thank you to our amazing speakers, and thank you to our artists.